our president is ill. I guess unfortunately for you, because you're stuck with me instead. And our vice president, fortunately, is in a warmer clime. So I'll be here to make a couple of announcements. First of all, I want to say that tonight is our 20th talk on Bethany history. And I've got to give you the commercial, that you get before every program. Those of you who have not joined for 2000, have joined in 1999. Remember, our memberships go on a calendar year. So if you're not a life member, your membership has expired if you have not become a member since January 1st. In that event, if you would join up on your way out, if you've not already done so, this will ensure that you continue to be on our mailing list and you get announcements of our programs like this. There are also dinner tickets available out there. We're going to have a fundraising chicken dinner, and that will be on March 10th right here in this room. And for those of you who have been to them before, they're very well attended and very well received. There are a few books about Bethany. We always try to put out a few books every time. We don't have everything out there, so if you come next time, you might not see those. So make sure that if it's something you want in your collection or you're looking for a gift for a friend, that you take this opportunity to pick one up. The next talk, continue our announcements, will be on Clovernook Farm, the Woodward Farm on Fairwood Road. And this will be given by Debbie Demander. And it will take place on June 9th, again, right here in this room. I've been asked by Les Warner to announce that there's going to be a Fireman's Oldies Dance March 4th. And for anyone interested in obtaining tickets to that event, see Ellie Miller after the show. She's raising her hand back there. Raise your hand. Wave both arms so we can see. Way to go. So sharp. Anyway, one other item of business that I'm very pleased and honored to be able to do this evening is to recognize someone who has made a great contribution to this organization and to the preservation of Bethany history. As many of you who are regular attendees of these events have noted that, from time to time, we do recognize such people. And tonight, I would like to present this plaque to Jerry Hungerford. It reads, Jerry Hungerford is hereby recognized and honored for her work and dedication on the Bethany Historical Society's successful fundraising drive to carpet the lower level of the Stanley Downs Memorial Building. 3 separate fundraisers were held: the 1999 Historical Society calendar, a special fundraising dinner, and sales of carpet squares. The fund drive was very successful and secured not only funds needed to complete the carpeting, but also had money left over, which was available to help purchase a computer for the society. The directors and members of the Bethany Historical Society would therefore like to thank Jerry for her major part in this important project. Previously, we have given an award to Johnny Barnett, and we have a similar one eventually for Mary Ann Lincoln when she comes to one of our events. At this point, I'd like to ask you to give a round of applause to Jerry Hungerford. I think the proper protocol is to show the award, shake hands, but I'm going to go beyond that. Because my wife's not here tonight.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And I just want to say thank you to everybody that contributed to these fundraisers, because you were the ones that really made it possible. Thank you.
For those of you who are tired of hearing me tonight, it'll be heartening to know that I'm about to turn this over to a very good friend of mine, long time, what do we call it, Don? I don't know, more than a friend, neighbor. Unfortunately, he has moved to another town that will remain nameless. It is to the south of us, however. Mr. Crisco, sorry. A little bit about Don. Don is one of those people who has had a lifelong interest in history. I don't know when it started, but it must have been sometime around the time that he learned to walk on two legs. And I think in junior high school and high school, he had a great interest in the history of his community, the community he grew up in, which was Cheshire. He spent a number of years raising his family next door to us in Bethany, became very interested in Bethany history. Upon moving to Woodbridge, he became very involved in preservation activities in Woodbridge, including becoming president of the Bethany and Woodbridge Historical Society, very active in a preservation effort to designate Litchfield Turnpike as a scenic highway, been very involved in the preservation of the South School in Woodbridge, and I could continue, but I think we're going to let Don speak for himself. Don Menzies, our speaker for tonight.
Thank you, Bob. Testing. 1, 2, 3. Is it working? How about from over here? Not too well. All right. Well, it's important that you hear this tonight. Thank you very much, and thank you very much for coming out on such a miserable, wet February evening. I hope we'll keep the drab and dreary out there, and we'll have a lot of fun in here tonight. A few anecdotes and acknowledgments, and a couple of disclaimers before we drop that first slide tonight. It's kind of interesting how the project got started. About 3 years ago, almost exactly, it was a cold January afternoon. I was sitting home and the phone rang. I picked it up and it was a fellow named William Kellett from Guilford, Connecticut. And he introduced himself and said that he was a direct descendant of William A. Clark from Bethany and Woodbridge in the matchmaking business. And did I know anything about the man? And I had to admit over the phone that I knew absolutely nothing about him other than that he did run a match business. And I couldn't really help him in his endeavors to find out more about his relative. He told me, however, that he had quite a bit of material from Mr. Clark's life and his records. And we would like to get together sometime and talk with you about that. And I thanked him very much. And I hung up the phone. About an hour later, I trudged up to the Woodbridge Historical Society, the Thomas Darling House. And you have to check the place every once in a while, make sure that no pipes are frozen, and get the mail, and that sort of thing. And as I was going through the mail, I came across a letter from Spain. Now, we don't get many letters from Spain at the Woodbridge Historical Society. It was addressed to me, which made it a little more unusual. So I opened it up, and it was a letter which started out, Dear Mr. Menzies, my name is Susan Lord Delonzo, and I'm a direct lineal descendant of William A. Clark from Bethany and Woodbridge in the matchmaking business, and I'd like to know more about my family. Well, I screamed audibly. It was all right. There was no one at the Darling House at the time. And I just took it as a sign that I needed to learn more about Mr. Clark and his doings. So I started on an endeavor to learn more about him, and that's kind of how this talk got going. I tell you that story just because it's a good story, and also to say that this is really a collaborative work. I amassed a lot of stuff that other people have already learned about. William Kellett and his cousin Susan Lord Alonzo from Madrid, and Bill's brother Roger from Brooklyn, Maine, actually contributed a great deal to this talk. And in addition to that, one other person was very instrumental in helping me out, and that's Arnold Peterson. Arnold is here tonight. I'd say a good half of what you see on the table up here is from Arnold's collection. Arnold has spent many, many years investigating and collecting the manufacturing history of a lot of towns in this area: Bethany, Woodbridge, Oxford, Beacon Falls, New Haven, and this area of New Haven County. And he knew most of this stuff already anyway. So he was very instrumental in helping me put this talk together. And of everyone in this room tonight, only Arnold has permission to jump up at any point in the meeting and say, "That's not true." And Arnold, I invite you to do that. I say that knowing that Arnold would never do that, but indeed, if I do kind of mix up some of these dates, and it does get a little bogged down in dates, Arnold, please feel free to correct me. William Clark was a Bethany man. There's just no question about that. He may have conducted most of his business in Woodbridge and Westville, but most of his life, he was a citizen of the town of Bethany. That was until a certain entity came along around 1864 and kind of played a trick on him, and one morning he actually woke up in Woodbridge. But there's more on that later. My last disclaimer is that there's no way around it, really. Any talk about William A. Clark is necessarily a talk about the history of the friction match and the match business in America. And a great deal of what we're going to talk about tonight is that. It was a great part of his life, and so it's going to be a great part of this talk. I just hope that you have half as much fun enjoying it tonight as I did putting it together. And with that, if we can have the man back there with the lights and the man up there turn on the slide projector, we'll get this show on the road. This is a small document box that belonged to William A. Clark and from Bill Kellett's collection. And I use it as my first slide to say, what's in a name? When we talk about Woodbridge and Bethany in the 19th century, to use the name Clark or Sperry is almost to use the word or name Smith today. There were lots of Clarks. There were even a lot of William Clarks in this area and in the state of Connecticut. But there was only one William A. Clark, and Mr. Clark was very, very careful to use his middle initial throughout his lifetime. And we're very grateful to him for doing that. This is also a matchbox, another box from Bill Kellett's collection. It actually dates from about the mid to late 1870s, but it really epitomizes, kind of to me anyway, the power and glory of the 19th century industrial revolution in America, sort of the American dream. And Mr. Clark's story really is as much part of that as anything else. He is sort of a rags to riches kind of story that was epitomized in characters like Horatio Alger of the later 19th century. There's a better picture of the box. You can see where it talks about being from the Clark Match Company, superior friction matches. The story really begins more with what life was like before the friction match comes on the scene. There were people dabbling in small chemical explosions, if you will, even as far back as the 17th century. But for most people who lived in the 18th and early 19th century, this was one of the main modes of getting fire. This is called a tinderbox. This was actually a tinderbox candlestick in collection of the Woodbridge Historical Society. It actually belonged to the Thomas Darling family, as near as we can tell. And the way it worked, for those of you that don't know, it was kind of a sacred piece. You didn't want to ever run out of fire, summer, winter, spring, or fall. And if you did, you would go to your nearest neighbor's house if you could and get fire hot coals from them and bring them home. But if you were really stuck, you had to resort to this sort of device. You can see, I pull up my trusty laser pointer, and don't put anyone's eye out with it. It's comprised of a steel, a flint, a piece of flint stone, and it's a very dry material. This is a piece of cloth. There would often be shavings, but it was kept as dry as possible because you had to strike the flint against the steel to make the fire. There was no way around it. And I got to tell you, I stood there for about 20 minutes one day trying to even make a spark on the thing, and I couldn't do it. So it was very important that you knew, A, how to handle the device, and B, that you had extremely dry material to make it work. One of the things I thought I should try and do in any talk about the history of matches is to try and find out the history of the word. That was not as easy as I thought. I actually borrowed one of Gilbert Whitlock's Webster's International Dictionaries that he has on the shelf at the book barn. And I looked up the word match. And as near as Mr. Webster could ascertain, the word comes from the Latin word mixa, M-Y-X-A, which means lamp nozzle. Kind of a stretch for me, but apparently the old lamps that worked on oil had a wick that actually came out of a nozzle, and that was where the fire was, so perhaps that's where the term came from. The first friction matches, or actually they weren't even friction matches, came on the scene, we think in England in the late 18th century. There was a patent in New England as early as 1814 in Vermont for what were called chemical matches, which is why I have this little broadside photograph here. They were also called oxymurate matches, and they were made from a conglomeration of sugar, believe it or not, and chlorate of potassium, and some other chemicals like brimstone, which we know is sulfur, and it was made into a paste with some gum arabic and colored so that you could see it on the end of the splint sticks. And the stick was actually dipped into this material and allowed to harden. Now that sounds very much like a match, but listen to how you had to light the thing. You took a piece of asbestos. Right away, it doesn't sound like much fun to me. You take a piece of asbestos material and you soak it in sulfuric acid, even worse. And apparently what you then did was very carefully put the end of the match onto this wet asbestos and held your breath, and a small explosion occurred, and if you were lucky, fire came afterwards. Yikes. This little broadside is really kind of neat. It was in the collection of the Historical Society match boxes and paraphernalia, and it's for a phosphorus pocket light. And we can tell, and Gilbert I think could probably back me up on this, if you look at that decorative border around the outside, to me it denotates an item that was printed anywhere from the very, very earliest years of the 19th century, anywhere from 1800 maybe up through 1830. It's just a very definitive border that was used in Bibles and other books of the period. And from the typeface, we can tell that it was probably done after 1810 because they're no longer using the long S in the words. For instance, the word stopper here would have had a letter, instead of the S you see there, would have had more of an F type of letter, which was from the ancient German script, and that was carried through in printing right up through the early part of the 19th century in New England. We also know that this was American because it talks about being at Greenwich Street near Fort Gainsborough, which I think it's New York City, and it talks about the bottle of liquid that you need to light this match, and it says that the bottle will be replenished at the above place for 31 cents. So we know this is a very early American broadside for matches. If you can all see this one. Some of the very first matches were called lucifers, for obvious reasons. And as I said before, some of the earliest matches came from England. This is a matchbox from Bill Kellett's collection. It had never been seen before in public until he showed it to me and allowed me to photograph it. You can see that the stick below it is really just like a writhing stick with that chemical that had been dipped in, colored with vermilion to make it blue, I believe. And anyhow, this is an improvement over the chemical match in that they use the same kind of chemicals, but instead of sticking it into the wet, sulfuric-ridden asbestos, you drew it between two pieces of sandpaper, which caused an explosion. And that was considered progress, believe it or not. This is probably one of the earliest matchboxes extant, I would guess. Again, from the typefaces and the decorative devices that they use, probably from about the 1820 period. Some of the earlier matches were also referred to as locofocos, which literally meant the strike anywhere match. We used to have those even up when I was a kid, the blue tip matches where you could light them on anything. Interestingly enough, around the same time period, the 1830s, there was a political party that was kind of volatile, and they had became known as the locofoco party. The first wooden matches made in our area were reported to have been packaged in small wooden boxes. And we believe that these are some of the first boxes made to house matches in Bethany and Woodbridge. They were found in the collection of the Woodbridge Historical Society, so we're quite sure they're the real McCoy. And they were probably made by one of the very first matchmakers in this area, who was not William Clark. We'll get to him very shortly, but it's important that you know about a man named Thomas Sanford. There's a lot of legend about Mr. Sanford, about where he lived and about what he did. But we think that Lucy Finney, a Woodbridge historian, came up with one of the most accurate pictures of Mr. Sanford. He was a Yankee peddler, and he went up and down the area plying his trade, peddling his wares. And he also used the barter system. Instead of taking cash for an item, he would take something in return. And the story is that he, in exchange for a copper kettle, took a formula for fire sticks from a man, and no one knows who. And the man said, if you could perfect this formula, you could make a lot of money making matches. And apparently he did some experimentation early on in Woodbridge. We do have one box from Thomas Sanford's match business that does say Woodbridge, Connecticut, but this one seems even earlier than that. And I don't know if you can read the fine print down there, but it says Oxford, Connecticut. And when we first came across this box, which also was from Bill Kellett's collection, we were a little concerned because we thought that Mr. Sanford worked only in Woodbridge. Apparently not. Now, Sanford did appear on the electors list for 1836 in Oxford, which was very early. But he was actually in that portion of Oxford, East Oxford, which became Beacon Falls. Actually, Bethany first in 1839, and then Beacon Falls in 1871. So we could actually say that Mr. Sanford might have made matches at Oxford, Bethany, Woodbridge, Beacon Falls. I don't know. It's clear from this matchbox, though, that maybe the first place he made matches was in Oxford. At some point early in the 1830s, though, he did come to Woodbridge and moved into this house, which is on the road that is named for him, Sanford Road in Woodbridge, now owned by Bobby and Charlie Griffiths. He carried on the match business here. We think the matchbox that we had came from this shop, this home. He actually experimented in his kitchen and exploded his kitchen at one point, trying to make matches. He added onto his house, he added a wing that served as a dormitory for people to come make matches at his house. Now, I don't want to belabor Mr. Sanford too much longer, but it's important that you know that in 1852, he partnered with a man named Anson Beecher. Apparently they had signed agreements for a 5-year co-partnership, but Mr. Beecher dissolved that after about 2 years, and then he went to Westville to carry on the match business, and he was very, very successful at it. And Mr. Sanford is reported to have died a fairly poor man. Now, the other part of the story, here's actually to show you that Mr. Beecher did go on to become very successful. You see, he had a New York office where he made matches in Westville. The other part of the legend about Mr. Sanford is that he decided to go into the match business in a big way, and he purchased an area around Bladen's Brook, which is the little brook that runs along Seymour Road in Bethany and Woodbridge, and that he built a gigantic water wheel to power his mill. Apparently it was too big for the water to push it. At least that's the rumor. And that in absolute destitution and discouragement, he gave up the match business, and for a very small amount, he sold his formula to a man named William A. Clark. At this point, I have to do a little sidebar. You can't see this. It's a tiny little piece of paper, a tiny little letter that I found buried deep in the archives of the Historical Society in Woodbridge. And it's just a marvelous piece of paper in that it takes a legend and it gives credence to it. And it's not often when you can do that. I'm reading the handwriting of a woman named, I believe it's Harriet Hine, who lived in Woodbridge, and she's writing, I believe, in 1911. And it says, I remember hearing Thomas Sanford say in my father's house, my father was Nelson Newton of Woodbridge, Connecticut, that he worked for months on perfecting the friction match, whittling out the sticks by hand, and then sold the right to manufacture them to William A. Clark of Bethany for $10. And it's signed Harriet Newton Hine, New Haven, Connecticut, February 1911. And then underneath it, to give further credence to this letter, there's a certificate of authenticity, so to speak, that says, "This is to certify that the above and foregoing was written by Miss Hine at her house in New Haven in my presence," and it's signed by Rollin C. Newton of Woodbridge, Connecticut. And Rollin Newton was a very prominent Woodbridge man, very active in local politics in Woodbridge, and a very well-respected man of the late 19th, early 20th century. So if he put his signature to something, it was like seeing it in the sun. You know it's true. So we can now say with absolute certainty that Mr. Sanford did give up his match formula to Mr. Clark for $10. It also says, as a little postscript at the end of this letter, Mrs. Hine says that her mother told her, her mother told Mr. Sanford that he was a very foolish man to sell the recipe. Well, yes, he was. One other thing on this slide, you can see to the right-hand portion of it, you can see some stone foundation work here, and we think this is the part of Bladen's Brook where Mr. Sanford tried to build a water wheel, and it's a very massive stone structure in comparison to the deep medieval stream. About William Clark's ancestry, we know actually quite a bit. His father was Jonathan Clark. This is not a picture of Jonathan, but it is a picture of what Jonathan did. Jonathan was born in 1783 and was the 7th generation of Clarks who first came to this area in 1639 in Milford. Interestingly enough, all of Jonathan Clark's relatives, his father, grandfather, great-grandfather, were all named George. There were 6 of them until Jonathan came along. And he married Amelia Osborne sometime around 1808, and they moved to Bethany. A perusal of the tax records for Bethany and Woodbridge show Jonathan Clark first appearing in Bethany in 1810 with 1 cow and 7 sheep, no house. He was a resident, but he must have been living under someone else's roof. Actually, no house until 1812 when he is taxed on 2 fireplaces. The land records show that in 1811, Jonathan Clark purchased a piece of land in Woodbridge Bethany Society with a dwelling house, a barn, and 3/4 of an acre. And we know that today as a typical house lot of the 19th century. That's what you would end up with when you were starting out in life as a farmer. And this house lot was subject to the encumbrance of the widow's dower. And so we know that what happened here was that Jonathan Clark moved into his deceased father-in-law's house, or inherited it, and his mother-in-law retained 1/3 use of it, the house, for the rest of her life. A very common occurrence back then. But he never moved out of the house, and he never really acquired any more than 12 acres of land. That's kind of important to remember when we talk about William later on. He was just a typical farmer from Bethany in the first half of the 19th century. And Jonathan and Amelia had only 2 children. First was named Eliezer Eli. This is not Eliezer Eli. I changed the slide too soon. This is his second son, our subject for tonight's discussion, William Allenson Clark. That's what the A stands for, and we didn't know that until Bill Kellett called me that fateful day in January and was able to fill in that part of the puzzle for us. And I think that actually comes from a family in Milford, though I'm not absolutely positive. But William A. Clark was born Christmas Day, December 25th, 1810. And the genealogical records say that he was born in Seymour. I don't think it's true unless his mother was there visiting someone when she delivered. Because, as I said, his father lived in Woodbridge, his brother found in Bethany, his brother was born in Bethany. So something's wrong with that picture. But I would say that he was born in Bethany in 1810. We haven't discovered any details about Mr. Clark's early years, only that he was endowed with inventive genius of a high order, and with something around 20 patents to his credit over the course of his life. This is kind of a mild understatement. Of his education, we can only assume that it was in the one-room schoolhouse that was very near where he grew up on Peck Hill Road, but we just don't know. Surely Jonathan Clark couldn't afford to send any of his sons to college, so we don't believe Mr. Clark had any kind of a college education. But what did he do to learn the skills necessary to invent the kind of things that we're going to see that he dabbled in for most of his life? Well, unfortunately, we just don't know. Where did he get the money? at the age of 24 to open his very first business as a matchmaker in agrarian Bethany in 1835. Maybe a good part of the rest of the world was participating in the American Industrial Revolution, but by and large, Bethany and Woodbridge folks were rock farmers. And there were only very few manufacturers, and they were mostly just a typical grist and sawmill. It's pretty safe to say that in 1835, Bethany was still kind of pre-industrial. This is a picture of Mr. Clark's very first account book that is also in the collection of Bill Kellett, and it documents very carefully a lot of the items that he purchased right from the beginning to put himself into business. You can't really see from this slide, but this is the first page of his account book with, on top of it, one of his probably very first match boxes that he used to sell his matches. He made different kinds of matches. He made all but the chemical match, the one that you had to stick in the sulfuric acid and the asbestos. Page 1 of the account book starts about October 8, 1835, where he says, bought and paid for. This was right up front, before he even sold a match. Paper, potash, which is potassium, antimony, gums, glue, etc. for $9.41. 10 pounds of antimony for $1.67, a quarter of a ream of sandpaper for $1, and wrapping paper for 82 cents, some pine boards for $1.11, and brimstone, which we of course know as sulfur, for $1. He paid, interestingly enough, also on the first or second page of his book, it notes that he paid his first payments for matchboxes. This was a cottage industry that was very popular in Bethany and Woodbridge. Women would work in their homes, they get the raw materials for the boxes and build them, and then once every month or so they'd take their 100 or 1,000, however many they made, and cart them over to Mr. Clark's business and get paid for them. I believe they were paid 25 cents per 100 boxes, and it was no easy feat to make these things. As you can see from that box, you had to form it and glue it and put it all together. His first payments were to Lucia Osborne and A. Johnson, both, I believe, Bethany residents. And the first one was for $1.10, so we can tell how many boxes she made. And Johnson was for $2. But even as late as 1868, I have a diary from Josephine Bishop, who lived in the house that we lived in Woodbridge. And her diary says that on Tuesday, January 14, 1868, I learned, that's learned, L-A-R-N-E-D, Eunice, how to make matchboxes. And on Friday, March 27th, Mother and I went to the match shop today. Went to Mr. W.A. Clark's house and saw Jessie's piano. Jessie was his daughter. And I played on it. It was a beautiful one. And indeed, the tax records show that in 1867, William A. Clark did indeed buy a piano. Again, this picture of the very earliest matchbox label that we have. Is that focused too well? I can't really tell from over here. I'm making it worse. It clearly says that it was made in Woodbridge, Connecticut. Now, Mr. Clark jumped right into the business. He started exporting his matches, at least down into New Haven. W.H. Dawson Company on State Street was one of the first. But in 1836, less than a year after his operation, he records expenses to New York for $8.25 and expenses to Boston in 1837 for $14. So he was running business up and down at least New England and New York. And we also know that he sold matches as far away as New Orleans. At that point in time, a gross boxes, that's 144 boxes of matches, would cost you $8. And his first year, he sold 859 gross matches. That's about 123,000. And at its height, the business made about 20,000 gross of matches per year. And that was a lot of board feet of timber for matchsticks. And on a kind of more personal note, in 1841, he was married to Emily Dibble of Woodbridge. And this is Emily in later years, probably in the mid-1870s. The tax records indicate that Mr. Clark's, he acquired his second house in Bethany about 1841. We don't really know where his first house was. but his second house was in Bethany, and in that house they had 4 children. The first was named William Eugene. He died at 26 years old, about 1869, in the city of New Orleans, and he was a soldier in the Civil War, and the family rumor is that he stayed down there after the war to bury dead Northern soldiers, and that he had met someone and fallen in love down there, but he is not reported to ever have been married, but that he died in 1869 of yellow fever. The next son was Theodore Dibble Clark. He died at 31 years old in the 1870s. He was washed overboard, lost at sea. He was on a ship that had been going around the world. Apparently that was his business. I believe he was just, he shipped on board. I don't think he owned the ship, but he was washed overboard and never heard from again. There was one other son named Frank E. Clark. There'll be certainly more about Frank later. And then they had one daughter named Jessie, I've already referred to, and a little more about Jessie later on as well. Here's the house they moved into in 1841. Actually, some of you may recognize it today. It's still in existence. It kind of looks like this now. Very similar to the picture you just saw, which was from about 1880, 1890. It's red now, but it still has that front porch and the same sort of configuration. Now, we came out with a book in 1995 in Woodbridge on historic Woodbridge. This house was, at that point, thought to be about an 1850, 1860 colonial, just from looking at it from the outside. But when we got inside and examined it, we found clear evidence that the roof line had been lowered, that a few of the early features of the house, which dated sometime between 1790 and probably 1815, had been changed around, and indeed it looked very much like a house from about 1850. So we know now that Mr. Clark, in his newly found affluence, took his home and remodeled it about 1858. This is the little garage next to William A. Clark's house in Bethany. And it looks like a garage now, but if you look at those 4 windows across the top, you have to stop and think, why 4 windows in a garage like that? And Arnold has brought some photographs tonight that are actually being shown publicly for the very first time. They're up front here in the little wooden frames, and I invite you to take a close look at them afterwards. They do show the house with this building from a much earlier time. And you can see that instead of the garage doors, there are more windows down there. And indeed, we found out that this was one of the matchbox workers' dormitories. He would hire women to come work at the factory, and they'd come and work for the week and live in the dormitories and then go home on weekends. Another building that is recognizable to us today along Seymour Road and along Bladen's Brook is what we now call Strong's Mill in Woodbridge. It is actually the site of Mr. Clark's main matchmaking business. I have a slide of that coming up later. This is all that is left of that. You can see, though, the dam that was built to back up the river so it would come around and be used for water power, and the spillway that's still in working order today. This is a house on the south side of Seymour Road, and I include it as another one of the matchmakers' dormitories. It's been much enlarged and improved into a full-blown dwelling house today. As is this house, which is on North Pease Road. It's actually been moved. We're not actually sure from where. Some people say from the Weppawag River area, which would make it out of the realm of this talk as being owned by Mr. Clark, who doesn't have any buildings that far away. But it is reported to have been a matchmaker's house, so I include it. The other interesting thing about this house is that sometime, I think in the 1960s, Arnold, you added this front porch, and it's actually a much earlier porch from the old Clinton Hotel, just over the Bethany line in Naugatuck. Pardon me?
Columns.
Yeah. Just the Columns?
Not Clinton Columns.
I'm sorry, the Collins Hotel. You're right. And its heyday, Mr. Clark employed at least 15 people in the factory, but I would guess more by the size of this. This is a painting of a photograph. You can see the actual photograph up here with the rest of the materials after the show. It's a 4-story, maybe 3 stories in an attic, This is the main matchmaking building that Mr. Clark operated throughout the 1830s through the 1860s and 70s. This, I think, is the only portion that's remaining, and that's the area, the house that we now call Strong's Mill. In 1860, it's interesting to note also that there were 75 matchmakers in America, and 9 of them were in Connecticut. Come back to Bladen's Brook just to tell you 2 stories that come to us from the Clark family tradition. One is that at one point in time, and we're not sure when, William Clark imported some Chinese labor that lived in one of the dormitories and worked in the match shop. And the story that they tell us that the folks from China got here and before too long became very homesick. But one day they were working around the Bladen's Brook area and they found a stash of watercress. Now maybe it was growing in the pond by the mill, but it was apparently something that they considered a delicacy. And ate and ate and ate, and it helped alleviate their homesickness. The other story is not such a pleasant one. Apparently there was one health problem associated with the making of matches, and it's something called phosphorus necrosis. And it sure sounds horrible, and it was. Apparently there were some gaseous fumes that were given off in the matchmaking process that worked their way through your teeth. If you had tooth decay, it would actually work its way through the tooth decay and into your jawbone and dissolve your jaw. This is a marvelous little device that came to light when we were researching for the talk. It's in the collection, again, of Bill Kellett. It is one of William Clark's actual patent models for a matchmaking machine. I'm sorry I couldn't have it here tonight so you could look at it up close and personal, but it's a very detailed miniature wooden machine that it's called a patent model. He must have submitted it along with his patent to get approval to go ahead and manufacture the full-fledged machine. We actually have a paper, and it's on display here tonight, in Mr. Clark's own handwriting that describes just such a machine, and we think that this may be the actual machine that he had patented to make matches. Here's another view of it. Very intricate, very well made, and very fragile. Bill Kellett and I handled it maybe 2 or 3 times and ended up breaking 2 pieces of it. Here's a map from about the date 1856. And this is where we get into the conundrum of how Mr. Clark could live in 2 places at once or wake up one morning in Woodbridge. This is part of the New Haven County wall map that was published by Smith in Philadelphia in 1856. And it clearly shows the boundary between Bethany right here and Woodbridge right here. It's running along roughly this straight line. And this is the boundary that was set up in 1832. And it was carefully perambulated by selectmen of both towns. The line was very accurately laid out so there could be no mistake. And I point this out to you so that you see that very sharp straight line over there. And up in here, if you can see it close enough or see the real McCoy, you would see that right around in here is Mr. Clark's dwelling house and residence and one of his match houses, right about where the pointer is. Okay, remember that. And now we go to a map about 12 years later. This is the 1868 Beers, Ellis, and Sewell map of New Haven County. And this is of the Woodbridge map. And it clearly shows a line going across here. And can you read that? It says Old Town Line. And the Woodbridge School District here is in green. And you can see that green now extends all the way up to follow Bladen's Brook. And you can see here is Mr. Clark's residence. Mr. Clark's, one of the dormitories, probably the little garage now where he housed some workers. Here is J. Clark Estate. This is the house that William A. Clark grew up in and is no longer standing. All of this prior to 1868, and indeed up to about 1864, was the town of Bethany. And for some reason, unbeknownst to us, in spite of our involved attempts to discover why, was put aside as what they call a set-off by the Connecticut State Legislature in about 1864. We have no idea why. But Arnold has told me that he read somewhere, and we haven't found out where, we haven't found the source again, but he read somewhere that Mr. William A. Clark adamantly wished that the town line would not be changed. He did definitely want to be remain a Bethany resident. But that's what happened. By an act of Connecticut legislature, one morning he woke up and his town line had been changed. This is a painting done by a Woodbridge artist named Florence Morgan. Actually, Florence lived in the 19th century and into the early 20th century. This is the house that she grew up on. This is Amity Road, about 1868. Most of these buildings are still here. This is the Hodgwaite's house right next to the veterinary hospital that's on Amity Road. The schoolhouse is still here, though it's been moved back and has been made into a private dwelling house. I show you this to show you what it was like living in Bethany and Woodbridge, a real slice of life from 1868. This could be a cart full of Mr. Clark's matches on its way down to New Haven. They'd be put on board a ship to go to New York, Boston, or New Orleans to sell matches. It's quite a marvelous picture. And I also put it in to tell you that Mr. Clark, in spite of being involved in the match business, was also civically minded. He served on several Bethany and Woodbridge town committees, and he also served for 1 year, and we just recently found this out, as president of the Bethany and Woodbridge Agricultural Society. Now, those are the folks that from about 1858 through the 1880s put on the annual Bethany and Woodbridge Agricultural Fair, much like the Durham Fair today. In fact, very much like the Durham Fair today. And Mr. Clark, for the year 1866, was president of that organization. He actually ran a very prosperous farm in Bethany and was a noted dairy farmer. In 1837, he only had 13 acres of land, but by 1855, he had 197 acres of land. He had 10 pair of oxen, 40 sheep, and 10 or 15 cattle, and he was running a model farm. In fact, he built a gigantic barn on Seymour Road that was considered a model barn. People came from miles around to view Mr. Clark's barn. Until tonight, we thought we didn't have any pictures of that barn, so I can't include it in my slide lecture because that was put together before tonight. Arnold has come forward with some photographs that he got today from a friend showing that barn. So if you haven't seen it, it's up front here in one of these 3 wooden frames. It's a massive barn and it's quite beautiful to see. He can tell you more about exactly where it is and what went on in and around it. But Mr. Clark was not only a successful matchmaker at this time, but he was a very successful farmer as well. About 1862, the federal government, through the IRS, to help defray the cost incurred of the Civil War and the impending cost of the Civil War, put a tax on matches. And there was 1 cent tax on every box of 100. Now, this lasted all the way up to about 1883. Every match manufacturer could furnish their own design for the match stamp, the tax stamp, but it had to be approved by the IRS. And if it was approved, the IRS would handle the printing of the stamps, but it was at a charge to the proprietor. In other words, Mr. Clark had to pay for his own tax stamps. And the IRS retained the dies. They tried to keep very careful control over the issuance of these tax stamps. They're very rare, very hard to find. We have one matchbox up here tonight that does have some of those hard-to-find tax stamps on it. This was actually done after Mr. Clark's years in the business. It does say around here, F.P. Newton's successor to Clark Match Company. But this is indeed a photograph of William A. Clark. You can tell with his classic white beard. As I mentioned, Mr. Clark had 3 sons. 2 of them died very young, and there was 1 son left over. His name was Frank E. Clark. And Frank did indeed take the business over from his father from the years 1870 to 1872. You can see this document bears his signature in 2 places, and it is dated 1872. Frank, due to ill health, could not continue with the business, so he had to give it up. He did move to Chicago in 1880 and eventually married a woman there and went on to live in Long Beach, California for the rest of his life. But before he left, he tried to settle his accounts with his successor to the match business. This is an invoice for $1,000. Frank had invested a lot of money in a matchbox making machine that he tried to get patented to help make more matches quicker and better. And he is here trying to recoup his losses from, or not his losses, but his investments from that. And he says a prompt settlement is requested. And we don't know that he ever got it. About this time, the match business gets very involved, very complicated. There are a lot of changes going on, so I'm not going to bog you down too much with all those changes. But just to finish off the match portion of the evening, here you can see the matchbox label. This was for a box of matchboxes from Frank Clark. Here's the exact same design from about a year later, where his successor, Frederick P. Newton, teamed up with a fellow named Brockett for 1 year only, and they took over the matchmaking business. Interesting that these two are just so similar. And here again are a whole bunch of letterheads and different matchbox labels. They're all up in front here tonight, just to show you the variety of matches that were made and the number of changes that were going through. And here's basically what happens. In 1873, Frank sells to his new brother-in-law, Frederick P. Newton of Woodbridge. Frederick Newton has a brief partnership with this fellow named Brockett for only 1 year. In one form or another, then Mr. Clark's son-in-law owns the match business until about 1880. And it's about this year that, remember a few hours ago I mentioned a fellow named Anson Beecher who made matches with Mr. Sanford for a while and went on to New Haven. Well, Mr. Beecher was very successful. He eventually merged his match business with a match operation from Wilmington, Delaware by the name of Swift and Courtney. And they became the Swift, Courtney, and Beecher Company. And they were, as you can see from this picture, very, very successful matchmakers. This is, I believe this is Blake Street right here, where Geometric Tool is now. Is that right, Arnold? Right. And so Whaley Avenue would be up along this way. The reason I tell you that is because the Swift, Courtney, and Beecher Company eventually merges with another company, I believe, from Wisconsin, and they become, in 1880, the Diamond Match Company of New Haven, Connecticut. And Mr. Frederick Peck Newton, who was running the Clark match business and trying to make a go of it, apparently did not wish to throw in with this new big, huge company. But he was under a constant pressure to do so. And finally, in desperation, and just to keep these guys quiet, I guess, about 1880, he offers his business at this bizarre, huge, ridiculous sum of money. And they took it. So then, at that point, the Clark Match Company was absorbed into the Diamond Match Company, and in 1889, it moves, I think, out to Chicago from then on. Here's Frederick Peck Newton. And the reason Frederick Peck Newton became the new owner of the match business because he married William Clark's only daughter, Jessie Amelia. And there's Jessie right there. I think she kind of looks like William Clark without the beard. But together, anyhow, they ran the match business and continued to live in Woodbridge until the 1870s when they moved to Grand Avenue, New Haven, and eventually to Dwight Street in New Haven. I'm going to do another sidebar here just to sort of finish up the match business. One of the great finds we had while we were researching was a letter from Frank Clark, who was William A.'s son, to Mr. Frederick Peck Newton. This is before Frank moves to Chicago. And just as Frederick Peck is taking over the business. And it's an 8-page letter, which I will not read all of to you, but there are a few important paragraphs that paint a very, very good picture of what what Mr. Clark was like, of what the business was like, of what the time was like. It's basically a letter to Frederick Peck Newton saying, if you're going to make this match business work, you are going to have to devote time and money, and you should stay in Woodbridge and do it. You've got to stay here to make it work. And he says, 12 years ago, our establishment was acknowledged to be in the front rank as far as economy and perfection of manufacture were concerned. Since then, few alterations and no improvements have been made. Other manufacturers, notably the Beechers, on the contrary, have made it a constant study to improve quality and lessen cost, and possessing unusually good inventive powers, have so far succeeded as to be able to manufacture a good article at a price that enables them to sell at our cost price and yet make a nice profit. And not only this, but they have brought out a new match that is, in my opinion, far superior to the sulfurs manufactured by us. When Father carried on the business, he almost always was behind his orders, and his customers were he never dared to increase sales, which they could have done very early at that time. Consequently, his sales averaged about the same year after year. When I took the business, I thought best to try and increase trade and promised customers that I would fill all orders promptly. They then sent out drummers in every direction and made a slight increase, as my books will show. I then turned my attention to a cheaper style in the parlor match. The idea of making a cheaper style was, however, soon abandoned, as that would necessitate the procuring of cheap help, which in Woodbridge is an impossibility. My attention was then turned wholly to the parlor match, and I had nearly perfected plans for an addition to the factory to manufacture them when failing health compelled me to sell out. So much for a history of the business use to the time that you have purchased it. And then he goes on to end his letter. I will, however, call your attention to the farm. This is, again, William A. Clark's model farm of the 1850s and 60s. You are aware that it is not paying Father much as now situated, and that if he retains it much longer, it will be necessary for him to expend a considerable sum on the buildings situated thereon. This we cannot reasonably expect him to do, and if we expect to have the use of the farm and buildings much longer, I do not see why we shall not be compelled to purchase. This, I am afraid, the company would not be able to do. So the farm was falling into disrepair. This because William A. Clark was sort of turning his attentions to other things, and he was letting the match business sort of run on its own and allowing other people to run it for him. This is Frank again, closing up his letter. After reading the above, you will probably ask what I would have you do. My answer is, if you have sufficient faith in your ability, notwithstanding the drawbacks that are peculiar to the business, and more particularly to the location, to put and retain a first-class parlor match on the market, if you think it possible to obtain the requisite help, if you desire to make Woodbridge your permanent home, if you think your health will allow you to give the business that close attention without which success will be impossible, if you can suggest some manner by which we can obtain a suitable and permanent boarding house, go ahead, by all means, and erect such additions as you think desirable, and that the company's finances will allow. A business of less than 100 gross per day will not, in my opinion, pay at present prices, and should the business become reduced below that, I should cry quit. And it's signed yours truly, Frank E. Clark. This is where, indeed, Frederick Peck Newton and Amelia Clark lived, though not in this house. This house was built about 1895 after the house that they lived in was destroyed by fire. It's on the corner of Newton Road and Seymour Road. And here is one of the last matchboxes probably that Frederick Peck Newton made. It appears he never made matches in Westville. They were always made in Woodbridge. But this box is very interesting. It says the original Clark match. manufactured by F.P. Newton. But if you look on the bottom of this box, the piece of sandpaper that's used to strike the matches on is a diamond shape. So we know that he had already sold out to the Diamond Match Company by the time this box was produced. You can see some advertisements the Diamond Match Company did probably around the 1930s, showing how proud they were of their early history in the match business in Woodbridge and Bethany. And this is the house that Frederick Peck Newton built about a year before he died. They had moved, as I said, to Grand Avenue and lived there up until about 1893. But this house was built, it must have been by 1894 because Mr. Newton was dead by 1895. And this is the house that William A. Clark's wife, Emily Dibble Clark, spent her remaining years. And to really finish up the match business now, I have this slide of the Milford Tricentenary Parade, and we have a picture of the young women dutifully sitting around the hearth and dining room tables manufacturing matchboxes. As I said, Mr. Clark's interests sort of were much more diverse than just matches. And indeed, he was very active in other businesses as early as 1852. We have some articles that show that he went into a co-partnership with a Bethany resident named Wales French. And Wales French ran a manufacturing business of hollow augers down in Westville. And William Clark in 1852 became co-partner with Wales French in this business. And in 1859, that partnership was dissolved through a foreclosure. William A. Clark actually got the entire business and manufacturing building, which he sold in about 1863. But he retained the use of many of the machines in the building because he was constantly dabbling in tools and other devices that he thought he could invent and make some money on. And his next most important invention had to be this device called an extension or an expansion bit. He patented his first ones, Arnold, was it around 1852? 58. Okay, this was right around the time he gets the business from Wales French. And these are marvelous little devices that allow you to drill various size holes without changing your drill bit. People copied these for generations, making little refinements here and there and patenting it under their own names. But this type of design, can you still get them today, Arnold?
I don't believe so.
No, but up through about the 1940s, they were making these types of drill bits, and they were called Clark's design. So another very successful invention. Arnold has a marvelous collection of these up in front tonight. Here's a close-up of one of the shanks, which is W.A. Clark cast steel. This is probably one of his earliest drill bits. Like I say, Arnold's collection is quite involved and spans that entire period, from about 1858 to the 1940s. Again, one of his other inventions of the day, which is something we probably no longer use today, are devices called hollow augers. And Arnold, I still don't get it right, but these were a tool that a wheel maker for wagons would use to sort of make a shoulder when he was fitting the spoke of the wagon wheel into the hub of the wheel. He had to make a little mortise to fit into the hub, and he would use a hollow auger to do that. William Clark had, I believe, 5 patents on the hollow auger. And that's partly because the business in New Haven was such a thriving one. His other invention, which we have on display tonight, were a set of screwdrivers, or a kind of a interchangeable part screwdriver. This one says it's Clark's best quality screwdriver, made by the R.H. Brown Company of New Haven, Connecticut. R.H. Brown was the successor to William Clark's manufacturing of tools like the screwdriver and the expansion bit. You can see that from the handle here, it's a little socket that the screwdriver would fit into and click into place, much like a socket set. And you could change it, put a chisel in there if you wanted to, a different screwdriver. Again, just more evidence of Mr. Clark's Yankee ingenuity. Another thing that he patented, and apparently very successfully, was something called an axle box. The carriage industry in New Haven in the 1870s and 80s was one of the biggest in the country. You can see from this factory that was, I'm not sure where it was at, down on the State Street area, I think. It was just one of many carriage-making facilities in New Haven. So they were making carriages like this and shipping them all over the country. Mr. Clark patented in America and in England this axle box, which I assume is this configuration right here by the hub, where the axle joins the hub. And Roger Kellett up in Brooklyn, Maine, has a beautiful vellum document that belonged to William Clark. It was his English patent on these axle boxes. Now, if anyone here tonight can tell me what this article is, they win a free lifetime membership to the Bethany Historical Society. That's a pretty fair bet that no one's going to guess what it is. It's another one of Mr. Clark's inventions. It's also up here in front tonight. It's in Arnold Peterson's collection. How he ever knew what this was, I have no idea. It's called a steak grease, or greth. And basically, it's a meat tenderizer. And Mr. Clark made many of these, and then other people followed his patent and made their own style. Very successful. In fact, I ran across a 1980 version of one at a tag sale last year, and that's also on display up here. It's basically the exact same idea. It's a device for plunging little knife blades into your meat to tenderize it. So even up 100 years later, Mr. Clark's design is being used for meat tenderizers. And I think you can't read the quote on the advertisement, but let me read it to you. It's from the Reverend J.M. Carroll, pastor of the Methodist Episcopal Church in Westville. And he says, now he's a minister, so you know this is true. It is just the thing for making tough beef toothsome. We regard it almost indispensable in our house. There are other similar quotes above. And you can see that Mr. Clark, as I said earlier, had over 20 patents to his name, always trying to invent something, always applying his genius. We have Emily Dibble Clark's diary. It's actually in Roger Kellett's collection. And this is a picture of Emily probably sitting on the porch of either the house that she and William Clark moved to Westville actually about 1870 or 1871, probably to be closer to Mr. Clark's businesses in Westville. So they actually left Bethany, we know, in 1864 to wake up in Woodbridge. And they lived there till about 1870 in the same house, and then moved down to Fountain Street, right near Forest Road. And the house may still be there, because there are a number of early houses still standing in that area, but we don't know which one it was. So she may have been sitting in her ladder-back chair in this photograph on that Westville home, or maybe even on the Dwight Street home, we're not sure. But she records in her diary for January 4th, 1879, Mr. Clark sick with a swelling on his neck, probably esophageal cancer. The doctor came again today. Saturday, the 11th, Dr. Pierpont and wife here. Last day, Mr. Clark went downstairs. Tuesday, the 14th of January, Mr. Clark growing worse. And then on Wednesday, the 15th, Mr. Clark died at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. A sad day. Yes, it was. This is the Clark stone. They are all buried, or at least memorialized by this stone in Evergreen Cemetery, New Haven. And just about 4 doors down, Frederick Peck Newton is buried with his family, Jesse, and all the rest of them. So most of the Clarks involved in the match business now reside in New Haven at Evergreen Cemetery. Here's Mr. Clark. Here he is, Mr. William Allenson Clark, towards the end of his life. Now in the picture we saw of him earlier, he had more of a disheveled look, didn't he? More kind of an Einsteinian look about him when he was in the heyday of his inventive genius. But here we see kind of the face, I see the face of a man of wisdom now, I think. Maybe it's financial security, I don't know. He and his wife had their portraits painted in New Haven in the 1870s. These portraits now hang in Susan Lord Delonzo's home in Madrid. And she was very kind to send us some colored photographic positives, which we have made into life-size portraits of William and Emily Dibble Clark. They're here tonight. You didn't see them because I had their backs to you, so that it wouldn't give everything away. So when we turn the lights on, we'll turn these portraits around, and I invite you to come up and take a close look at these two Bethany residents. William and Emily lived in Bethany and in Woodbridge and in Westville, true. But the way I see it, they raised their children in Bethany. You know, they really spent most of the best years of their lives here. And so in my book, they are first and foremost Bethany residents. Our subject was indeed a man of inventive genius. He made quite a name for himself. He made a name that outlasted himself. And I guess no collection of Mr. Clark's inventions would be considered complete without a stake degree. But still, he will always be most noted for his celebrated friction match. And with that, I think it's time for refreshments. Thank you very much. I'd also be glad to answer any questions at this time, and if I can't, Arnold can. So if anybody has any questions, I'd be glad to field them. Otherwise, feel free to have some goodies, and I'll be up front here with all the materials, and I'll turn the Clarks around so you can have a good look at them. Thank you very much.
I want to thank you again for the superb job. Just one thing, when he gave this talk in Woodbridge, William A. Clark was a Woodbridge resident. But thanks again. Things to buy, things to eat. Thanks for coming.